Hello and welcome to our instructional series of videos. In this installment, we're going to show you how to upgrade or replace the stock solid-state drive in a 2019 27-inch iMac. Replacing the drive in these iMacs is an advanced installation with a risk of damage to your screen. It's highly recommended that you watch this video in its entirety before proceeding. If you're unsure about completing this installation yourself, professional installation is available. We've already backed up our data, gathered our materials, shut down and unplugged the iMac, and are working on a soft static-free work surface. We are now ready to begin. The display on the iMac is held in place with an adhesive around the edges, which you'll have to cut apart. This is an extremely tricky process which runs the risk of cracking the display, so you'll need to be very careful. Starting on one of the lower corners, insert the screen removal tool between the glass and the chassis. Take care not to put too much stress on the glass itself or it may crack. Work along all the edges of the iMac, taking care not to push the tool in too deep or pull out too far on the glass. All we're doing is cutting the foam tape holding the display on, not prying the glass away. The corners may be a little tricky, so you may need to go over them a couple of times. The process may take a little time, so be patient. Once you've worked your way all the way around, you can lay the computer face up on your work surface and attach the suction cups to the upper corners. Do one last check to make sure you've loosened all the adhesive around the edges of the iMac. Then lift the glass partway up using the suction cups. Inside, near the top, you'll need to detach two cables. For the first, simply slide it out of its socket. For the second cable, first lift up on the plastic tab to unlock the connector, then slide it out. You can then angle the display the rest of the way up and remove the adhesive holding the bottom of the display. Simply grab the tab of the adhesive strip on each side and slowly pull it towards the center until it comes free. Finally, use your opening tool to slit the last little bit of adhesive along the center, and you should be able to remove the display and set it aside. Now's a good time to peel up any residual adhesive that remains on the iMac chassis so that we can replace it later. Then, do the same for any adhesive on the back of the display. The next thing to do is remove the chin strap by first removing these 9 Phillips screws, then sliding the long piece out from under the lip of the iMac. Next, we need to loosen the 2 Torx T10 screws on the left speaker, then pull it forward and to the side slightly so we can remove the power button cable from the power supply board, and remove it from its channel in the left speaker assembly. You can then move the speaker off to the side. remove the two Torx T8 screws that hold the outer hard drive bracket in place. This should allow you to pull the drive out of the other bracket, disconnect the SATA cable, and set it aside entirely. You can now pull the left speaker further out, disconnect the speaker connector from its socket, and remove the cable from underneath the hard drive bracket, allowing the whole unit to be set aside. Now onto the fan. First, disconnect the fan cable from its socket. Then, remove these three Torx T10 screws holding the fan in place. You should then be able to separate the fan from the heatsink housing and set it aside. Now we can remove the right speaker. First, loosen these two Torx T10 screws. Then, pull the speaker unit forward and to the side slightly so you have enough room to disconnect the speaker cable from its socket. You should then be able to pull the speaker unit the rest of the way free and set it aside. Now it's time to remove the power board. You'll want to take care to avoid touching the metal leads on the bottom, as some electric charge may still be stored in the capacitors and can cause a shock. The first step is to remove the power supply signal cable. Do this by simply sliding the connectors of each end out of their sockets. Next, remove these four Torx T8 screws holding the board in place. You should now be able to lift the power board up and disconnect the cable attaching it to the main board. It's a tight-fitting connector, and there's a latch on the underside you'll need to press to release. Pull the board from under the lip of the iMac and rotate it up. You'll see one more cable attached near the bottom. It too has a latch that needs to be pressed in order to disconnect it. Once you've done that, you can set the power board aside. Next, we'll disconnect the Bluetooth and AirPort antenna cables. To help keep the cables in the right order, you can use a piece of tape to hold them together. Remove the two Torx T5 screws holding the antenna cable retainers and cover in place. You can then lift the metal cover up and off. Disconnect the four antenna snap connectors by lifting up on the cables as near to the connector as possible and lifting straight upwards. Be extremely careful doing this, as the connectors can be very tight and there's a risk of accidentally pulling the connector up from the board. Next, disconnect the camera cable by lifting up on the plastic tab to unlock it, then sliding the cable out of its socket. For the microphone cable, you'll need to lift up on the tiny latch on the opposite side of the socket, then slide the cable out. Finally, the headphone jack connector simply lifts straight up and off its socket. There are 8 Torx T8 screws holding the main board in place. 7 are located on the top of the board, while the 8th is located through this hole. This screw is a captive screw and can't be removed from the assembly itself. Three more screws hold the heatsink in place. There are two Torx T10 screws on the top of the heatsink itself, and this post, which is a Torx T25. Finally, route the SATA cable out from under the remaining hard drive bracket, and we're ready to lift the board up and out of the iMac. You may have to maneuver it slightly in order to get the various I/O port connectors out from around the post right next to them. On the back side of the main board, next to the I/O ports, you'll see the SSD. To remove it, simply remove the Torx T8 screw holding it in place, then slide it out of its socket. There's a notch in your SSD's connector that corresponds to a pin in the iMac's drive slot. Line the two up and slide the SSD into its slot. Once you've done that, you can secure the drive with the Torx T8 screw. To help align the ports with their cutouts in the chassis, there are two pins on the I/O assembly that correspond with two slots in the iMac. Taking care to ensure that none of the cables we disconnected earlier are trapped underneath the board, slide the main board back into place in the iMac. The pins will help ensure everything is aligned properly. Next, replace the long Torx T25 post. Then, the two Torx T10 screws on top of the heatsink. While you're here, you can route the SATA cables back under the hard drive bracket. Now it's time to replace the Torx T8 screws that hold the board in place. The two longest full-threaded screws go here. The middle-sized screw, which does not have a full thread, goes here. The remaining four short screws go in these spots. Finally, tighten the captive screw in this hole. Reattach the headphone jack connector by lining it up with its socket and pushing the two together. Next, slide the microphone cable into its slot as far as it can go, then lock it in place by flipping the handle on the other end down. Then, make sure the little metal latch is open on the camera cable, slide the connector into its socket, then latch it into place. After that, we can snap all the antenna cables back onto their connectors. The tape should have helped keep them in order. There are some small teeth on the antenna cable cover. These line up with the notches on the component immediately behind the antenna connectors. Slide the cover into place. Then secure it and the cable retainers with the Torx T5 screws. Now onto the power board. Attach the smaller cable to its port near the bottom of the power board. Make sure the cable connects completely and the connector latches. Lay the board down into the iMac, making sure the cable you just attached goes behind the screw post. You should now be able to connect the other cable to the main board. Again, make sure that the connector is fully seated into its socket. The two longer Torx T8 screws for the power board go into these two mounting holes. The two shorter ones go in the remaining holes. Reattach the power supply signal cable by simply sliding the connectors into their appropriate sockets. Next, set the right speaker roughly into place and slide its connector into its slot. You can then set the speaker properly and tighten its two Torx T10 screws. Set the fan into place, then replace its three Torx T10 screws. To reconnect the fan cable, simply slide it into its socket. Next, set the left speaker so that you can route the speaker's cable under the hard drive mount and slide its connector into place. You can now reconnect the SATA cable to the hard drive. There are two pins on the hard drive that correspond to two grommets on the mounting bracket. Slide these together and set the drive into place. Then secure the other bracket with its two Torx T8 screws. Before replacing the left speaker, we need to route the power button cable along the unit. On the tape portion of the cable, there's a thinner dimension and a thicker one. Insert a thin edge into the small groove along the speaker's bottom. Then, route the cable along the slot on the side of the speaker assembly. Set the speaker all the way into place, which should then allow you to easily slide the power button cable into its socket. You can then tighten the two Torx T10 screws on the speaker assembly. To replace the chin strap, it's usually easiest to attach the screw on one of the corners, then replace the others in order, adjusting alignment as you go. Now we're ready to close up. Set the display tape pieces in place according to the diagram that comes with the kit. You'll know their position correctly if all the holes and cutouts line up correctly with the shape of the iMac chassis. Once you've determined all the pieces of tape have been placed correctly, peel off the backing and adhere them to their places on the iMac. You can then peel off the backing on the other side to expose the adhesive that will attach the display. Set the display along the bottom edge as flush with the lip and as centered as possible, but don't let it close yet as we need to reconnect the last two cables. Reattach the video cable by sliding the connector into its socket and locking it into place with the handle. Then, simply slide the last connector into its socket. You can now carefully lower the display into place, making sure you have the edges lined up correctly. Gently squeeze along the edges to make sure the adhesive sticks. Use the microfiber cloth to avoid any extra fingerprints. You can now remove the suction cups and clean any remaining marks off your iMac. You can now plug your iMac back in, hook it up, and turn it on.